War II, a military governor met with General George Patton in Sicily, and he praised Patton highly for his courage and his bravery, when the general replied, "Sir, I am not a brave man. The truth is, I am an utter craven coward. I have never been within the sound of gunshot or in the sight of battle in my whole life that I wasn't so scared that I had sweat in the palm of my hands." And then years later, when Patton's autobiography was published, it contained this significant statement. "I learned very early in my life never to take counsel of my fears." I wonder what it is that makes your palms sweat. What is it that gives you that nervous pit in your stomach or makes you feel like you just aren't going to be able to breathe? And thinking about my own life, about the times when I felt inadequate, the times when I've felt afraid, the times when my palms have really started to sweat, there's really quite a list of diverse and varied experiences. Some of you have probably experienced some of them. Awaiting biopsy results or a medical diagnosis, going through a financial difficulty, walking through a strained relationship, being asked to step into a new role where I didn't really fill up for the task assigned, becoming a parent. In my case, that started with becoming a step-parent, being asked to meet a physical challenge I didn't think I could meet, like a backpacking trip in the Alaskan tundra. Some of you have heard me talk about my first funeral. I was 29 years old. I'd been ordained 4 months. I was serving at Calvin Presbyterian Church in Louisville, Kentucky, and the senior pastor went out of town for a week, and of course I was left in charge. And the son of a couple in the church who was 27 years old and struggling with mental illness took his own life. It was, as you can imagine, a very difficult and a very emotionally charged situation. And it was going to be one of those services where at the visitation, the line went around the building and the sanctuary at the service was just packed and overflowing. There were so many people gathering around this family and grieving the loss of this young man. Surely, they needed someone with experience, someone who knew how to address the difficult nuances of the situation. I was well aware that this situation was far beyond me, and that I did not actually know what I was doing, even when it came to logistics. I'd never led a funeral before. I was small, I was inadequate, and I was afraid. And then when it came time for the graveside service, well, that was an extra challenge because I'd never actually been to a graveside service. I'd only seen the kind of things they have on television and in the movies. God for that kind funeral director who sort of walked me through it and told me where I should stand. I knew the church was praying for me, and most importantly, I knew God was there with me. I felt God's presence very powerfully in the midst of that experience. I still remember it as I think about times when I felt weak, the way I felt surrounded and the way I experienced God's power moving and working through me, even at my weakest, even at my smallest. I was weak, God was strong. Can you remember a time like that in your life? When you were weak, but God was strong? Maybe you're walking through something right now where you really need to experience that reality. You feel very weak, and you need to be reminded that God is strong. This morning, we return to our series, God's Promise, I Am With You. And we've been talking about how this promise of God's presence is the central promise of the Bible. These promises and stories that we are examining are like Post-it notes reminding us of God's presence with us. In case you've been wondering why there are Post-it notes all over the building, that's why they're there. This image of Post-it notes as God's reminders to us. He is indeed with us. So when last we talked about God's promise to be with us, we were looking at the call of Moses when God asked him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt into the promised land. And so now we come to a time when Moses has led the people out. They've wandered the desert for 40 years. Joshua has led the people into the promised land. And they've been given strict instructions to be faithful to the Lord and not to be influenced by the pagan religion around them. But after just a little more than a generation in the land, the people have already begun to worship both Yahweh and Baal. So now we're in the time of the judges. The Israelites, well, they have problems. And their problems were called the Midianites. The Midianites had attacked the promised land, and the text says that they were like swarms of locusts taking over all the crops. It was so bad that the Israelites were taking refuge in caves, in holes in the ground, any place they could hide. And even though they hadn't paid attention to God for a very long time, they are now crying out to God for help. God sends a prophet to say, you must return to worshiping God alone. But they don't listen. And then God comes to one of the most unlikely characters in all of Israel, a man named Gideon. And I'm going to ask you to turn with me to Judges chapter 6. If you're looking at your Pew Bible, that's going to be on page 220. So we're going to look at Judges chapter 6, and we're going to begin in verse 11. But just go ahead and keep this open, because we're going to be sort of looking at 6 and 7 this morning and the story of Gideon. We're starting now in verse 11. The angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Gideon must have surely looked around and wondered who the angel was talking to. Gideon was a farmer who was so afraid that he was threshing wheat in a winepress. Now, pretty much everything I've learned about threshing wheat comes from preachers talking about the story of Gideon. But some of you are, I don't know, do we grow wheat in Carolina? Okay. So you know that this is something that needs to be done out on the open, usually like up on a hillside where there's a little wind, and the wheat is tossed and the chaff is blown away. It needs a large space with a breeze. I've been heard that threshing wheat in a wine press, which in these days was like basically a hole or a pit dug in the ground, a small space with no breeze, that would be like trying to fly a kite in a warehouse, or someone else called it trying to make coffee in a thimble. So whichever image is more ridiculous to you, just focus on that. Gideon did this because he was terrified of the Midianites, because the Midianites were very strong, and they would just come in. They would come in right around harvest time, and they would take everything, just like the locusts. They left no food for the Israelites. So he's afraid that if somebody sees him threshing this wheat, they're going to come and take it. So he's hiding out. He is not a man of great strength. We're going to hear more about that and more about his image of himself. But he's not even a man of great faith at this point. And we're going to see that too, that he sort of questions God and doubts it all. He's anything but a mighty warrior. But the angel of the Lord addresses Gideon in the terms of who he is being called to be, who God sees him to be. The Lord is with you, mighty warrior. And I believe God would say that to each one of us today. The Lord is with you, mighty warrior. All right, we see how this continues in verse 13. "Pardon me, my Lord," Gideon replied, "but if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us?" Remember I said he wasn't even somebody of incredibly strong faith at this point. "Where are all the wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?' But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian." The Lord turned to Gideon and said, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" "Pardon me, my Lord," Gideon replied, "but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." He is the least and the weakest. And doesn't he sound a lot like Moses here? Remember when God called Moses and Moses just gave a list? "I can't do this, I don't know your name, I am not a good speaker," etc., etc. Gideon is just telling God how inadequate he is. I'm like the I come from the smallest tribe, and in my whole tribe, my family's the weakest, and in my whole family, I'm the weakest. Like, I'm the least likely man for this job, God. But God doesn't respond with the reasons why Gideon is qualified, or the reasons why he can do it, or why Gideon should be confident in himself. And if you recall, God didn't do that with Moses either. God gives both Moses and Gideon the same response. How is it that they're going to be able to do what is asked of them? How is it that they are going to be able to accomplish this? They will do it because God is with them. And we see this in verse 16. The Lord answered, I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive. I will be with you. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Gideon is not some action hero. He is not a strong man. He is clearly not a confident guy. He's simply there trying to survive. And here's this little nobody, and through him, God does something amazing. God's vision of Gideon and God's promise to be with Gideon utterly changed Gideon's life. And Gideon's strength is not in himself, but in the God who promises to be with him. This is the hinge on which everything turns, not just for Gideon, but for you and for me. What is unthinkable, what is absolutely undoable on my own, becomes unstoppable when it's God and me. John Ortberg gives a wonderful account demonstrating this. I just had to laugh when I read his story about an experience he had when he was younger, walking in Newport Beach in Southern California. And he was with two friends. One was another staff member on the church, and one was an elder in the church. And I don't know if any of you have ever seen John Ortberg in person, but he's rather slight and just this gentle man. And he says they're walking along the beach, and they walk past a bar, and there's a fight that's been going on inside the bar that now sort of spills over out onto the street, just like in an old Western. And all these different guys are beating up on this one guy, and he's bleeding from his forehead, and they feel like they need to do something to intervene and to break up the fight. Ortberg says, I didn't have much experience in this kind of thing. I missed the class in seminary where we learned how to break up fights in a bar, and I don't think we were very intimidating. We went over to where the fighting was and said, hey, you guys, cut that out. And it didn't do much good at all. But then all of a sudden they looked at us with fear in their eyes, and the guys that had been beating up on the one guy stopped and started to slink away. And I didn't know why until we turned and looked behind us. Out of the bar had come the biggest man I think had ever seen. He was like 6 feet 7 inches, maybe 300 pounds, maybe 2% body fat. He was just huge. We called him Bubba. Well, not to his face, but afterwards when we talked about him. And Bubba didn't say a word. He just stood there and flexed. You could tell he was kind of hoping that they would try to have a go at him. All of a sudden, says John, my attitude was transformed, and I said to those guys, you better not let us catch you coming around here again. I was a different person, he says, because I had a great big Bubba. I was ready to confront with resolve and firmness. I was released from anxiety and fear. I was filled with boldness and confidence. I was ready to help somebody that needed helping. I was ready to serve when serving was required. Why? Because I had a great big Bubba. I was convinced that I was not alone and I was safe. But Bubba's not with us 24 hours a day. I mean, if he were, we'd have a really different approach to life, right? We just have confidence and boldness wherever we went if we took a Bubba with us. You wouldn't want to mess with us. Can't count on Bubba, though. He was there at that bar in California. But there's one who is greater than Bubba who has come. And you don't have to wonder whether or not he'll show up or whether or not he'll be there to help, because he is always there. You don't have to be afraid, Gideon. You don't have to live your life hiding. You don't have to thresh your wheat in a wine press. You have a great big God, and he's called you to do something. So get on with it. Now, God's first challenge for Gideon is to tear down an altar that was built to Baal. Now, this is a God that the Midianites and many other people in the ancient Near East worshipped. He was a tribal god, Baal, and the worship of Baal was associated with all kinds of yucky things. Prostitution, because he was a fertility god, and even child sacrifice. There was all sorts of darkness and superstition involved with the worship of Baal, and was a very dark time and brought a lot of darkness and ugliness. This worship and idolatry had to end. Baal was not God, so God chose Gideon to tear this altar down. But this is the thing. The altar was not built by the Midianites. The altar was built by the Israelites. And where was the altar located? On Gideon's property. And who built the altar? Gideon's own father. Now, how often do you think that Gideon stood up to his dad? Remember what he said? I'm the least in my family. But this is what God asked him to do. Go tear down that altar and the pole to Asherah, the altar to Baal, the pole to Asherah, and worship me, build an altar to me. Scripture tells us that Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord commanded him. He obeyed. Because he was afraid of his family and the men of the town, he did this at night rather than in the daytime. And Gideon had just cause to be afraid. This was a very big act and something that they would have seen as a very threatening. Gideon's dad found out what happened to Gideon, what Gideon had done, and surprisingly, Gideon's dad says, if Baal really is God, Baal can take care of himself. Let him take care of himself. You see, Gideon's big God faith was contagious. It even touched the heart of his father. So Gideon chooses to take this step of faith, this step of obedience. And his father, who also knew about Yahweh, but was doing this joint worship of splitting his affection, says, no, my son is right. I'm going to follow the way of Yahweh. So God's first act of deliverance for Israel, before Gideon ever defeats the Midianite army, is a spiritual action here. It's an action to take back the hearts of the Israelites and the worship of the Israelites. It's a command to strike at the root cause, this Baal worship. And like so many assignments that we get from God, we don't know what we can do. We don't know what God will do through us until we decide to obey, until we take that first step. And then the next step, and then the next step. So this is the first step that Gideon takes, and he isn't brave and bold about it. He does it under the cover of night, but he does it, and he does obey. And we see throughout the story that God is building his confidence, that God is building Gideon up in faith, and that God is leading him in a direction to be able to accomplish what God has for him. And we see here that the son sets an example for the father. This son who considered himself weak and insignificant, who considered himself the smallest in the family and the most insignificant. There's this deliverance from spiritual tyranny as they release the Baal worship and begin to worship the living God. And this is the groundwork for the military freedom that's going to come. So the spiritual freedom is beginning, and the spiritual deliverance, and then the military deliverance is going to come. But we know that Gideon still isn't confident. Miss Emily told us the story today about how he lays out this fleece 2 times and is sort of testing God and saying, are you really with me? Did you really mean what you said? Sometimes we talk about that when we're trying to discern God's direction. Well, I laid out a fleece. But really, in this account, this isn't a positive thing. This is kind of an expression of immature faith, not maturity. But God meets Gideon right where he is. God sees that Gideon is struggling and he needs this confidence boost, and God does this for him. And I think it's really beautiful, a beautiful example of how even as Gideon struggles and he isn't this person that's bold in faith, God meets him right where he is and says, yes, I'm going to do what I said I was going to do, and you need something tangible, something you can see and touch, and I'm going to give that to you. And God does. Then in the next chapter, in chapter 7, you'll see that Gideon and his men are to go to war against the Midianites. And at this point, Gideon has recruited 32,000 soldiers to join him. The Midianites had an army of 135,000, so the ratio is 4 to 1. And God comes to Gideon and he says, the enemy has 135,000 troops, you have 32,000, you've got a number problem. And Gideon says, yay, I'm glad you say that. I was afraid you were going to make me go into this battle completely outnumbered, 4 to 1. And God says, no, that's not what I mean about the number problem. The problem is there's so many people that you're not going to realize that it's my victory, and you're going to think you did it. So I want you to send home everybody who's afraid. Well, when he went out to his troops, everyone's afraid. 22,000 troops went home, leaving Gideon with 10,000 soldiers. So now Gideon's outnumbered 13 to 1. And then God tells him again, there's still too many. And so he has the men go drink water, and depending on how they drink the water, 300 are left. So Gideon is supposed to choose the ones that lap water like a dog. Old Testament scholar Doug Stewart says, most likely the idea is that the guys who lapped water like dogs drank in a way we would consider geeky or nerdy. These were not the elite troops. The whole point of God winnowing the troops down was to make clear that the victory was God's alone. These were the geeky guys that could hardly carry their sword and might trip over it, right? Israel was needed to break their cycle of sin, needed to break their cycle of idolatry, their cycle of trusting in these little g gods. By trusting in the infinitely big God, they needed to see that this great big God, Yahweh, was able to and had accomplished this thing. So they've been brought down from 32,000 to 300. Okay, so now the numbers are 450 to 1. That's how much Gideon and his soldiers are outnumbered. God has a reason for this. He gives Gideon one more sign. Gideon takes a step forward, and miraculously, the Midians took off running. If you don't know this whole story, read through Judges 6 and 7. It's a great story. I think it would make a marvelous movie. You can just picture, if you're like me and you always root for the underdog in those movies, you know, this is a great battle scene. Israel was free. They knew who their God was. It's my battle, says God. You don't have to live in fear. God uses small things so that God can get the glory. We see that very clearly in this story. And God specifically names, that is why I'm doing this, from 32,000 to 10,000 to 300, so that everyone will see whose victory it really was. God often uses small things so that God gets the glory. Think about one little nun named Mother Teresa. She was physically small. She was seemingly very insignificant. But she was also fully devoted to God. And one of her personal vows to God was, I will refuse you nothing. Anything you want to ask, Lord, the answer will be yes. Imagine what God could do with a heart like that. God is looking for hearts like that. In 1 Chronicles 16:9, it says, the eyes of the Lord are roaming to and fro over the earth in order to strengthen the hearts that are fully committed to him. God is looking for men and women who will say, Lord, here I am. I give you my all. Anything you want to ask, Lord, the answer is yes. One little life, as we see with Mother Teresa, can have very big ripples. The Lord says, I will be with you. The Lord says, I'm on your side and you will experience victory. But we worry, we get anxious, we experience great fear. I think this is a universal experience. And life is difficult. And the battles that each of us are facing, the obstacles that each of us are facing are really very big. Here's the good news. Things around you can be swirling out of control. But there's this inner reality. God is enough. He really is. That's why the Apostle Paul can say, I can do all things I can sit in a prison cell and face anything life has to throw at me through him who gives me strength, through Jesus. Nobody else besides Jesus can give this sort of peace to you. Your circumstances, your natural abilities, they can't give you this peace. This peace comes from God alone. And Jesus says to you today, I am bigger than your problems. I am bigger than your failures. I'm bigger than your regrets, many though they may be. I'm bigger than your sin. I'm bigger than your guilt. If you will let me, if you will try me, if you will open the door of your heart, I will come into your life and I will be your forgiver, and I will be your strength, and I will be your friend. Jesus makes possible this with God life, where we trust that God is enough. Because on the cross, we see a God who is bigger than our sin and guilt and regret. And in the empty tomb, we see a God who is bigger than death itself. Our God is so big. And our God sees. God knows about the Midianites in your life. He knows about your worries. He knows about your kids. He knows about what you've lost. He knows about the divorce. He knows about the crumbling marriage. He knows about the mistake. He knows about the regret. He knows about the job failure. He knows. He knows. He knows where you're stagnant. He knows where your dreams have died. God has better dreams for you. And if you just ask him, he will be a bigger presence in your life than you have ever known. And he promises you, just as he promised Gideon, I will be with you, and through me, you will be